Good morning, everyone. My name is Adero Robinson, and I proudly serve as the Executive Director with City Year Columbus. And I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Red Jacket Roundtable. So this episode and podcast is a series of conversations with nonprofit leaders in Columbus to discuss important topics related to youth development and advocacy in our community. And so our guest for today is Aaron Upchurch, who is the Executive Director for the Kaleidoscope Youth Center here in Columbus, Ohio. Since 1994, Kaleidoscope has become the largest and longest standing organization in Ohio, solely dedicated to serving and supporting queer youth. Kaleidoscope works to provide a safe place, programming, and leadership opportunities so that youth can be free to explore who they are and empowered to become their confident and truest self. The mission of Kaleidoscope Youth Center is to work in partnership with young people in Central Ohio to create safe and empowering environments for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning and ally youth through advocacy, education support, and community engagement. The vision of Kaleidoscope Youth Center is for youth across the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender identity to live healthy, whole lives with acceptance and freedom from oppression. So, Aaron, welcome today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love hearing folks say our vision and mission. It feels good.
It's an amazing vision and mission. So if we can start off talking about a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into this work.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. This morning, I was remembering in high school, my senior year, I graduated in 95, and there was a representative from City Year that came. And I wanted so bad to do City Year. Like, I begged my parents. They were like, no, go to college. You know, tough life, right? And so I did. I went to college and all of that. But I was like, this is so cool that like we're having this conversation, because I was like, I wanted to do it so bad. So I'm really happy to be here. I love when life kind of does this full circle moment. My background is I grew up in Hilliard, Ohio. Went to Davidson High School, and this is important just because I never thought I would be here in this space. But I was there, and it was just the one high school. Went to college at Eastern Michigan University, got my degree in social work, did social work practice for a few years, like foster care and things of that nature. And I started working in HIV and AIDS, and I got really excited to see communities come together to make change. There was something like I knew it could happen in, from my social work courses and, just growing up, but there was something about working with communities that are traditionally marginalized and like have to fight for their dignity. And I went back to school, got my master's degree in social work, and I did some things in statewide politics and organizing for about 3 years. Even ran for school board 1 year. Worked in community mental health for about 7.5 years as an assistant clinical director. And then I found myself here at Kaleidoscope, and it wasn't my intended path. I actually have been in private practice as a therapist. My partner and I own a business. I teach at OSU. So I was really looking to be more of a decidedly self-employed person. But when this opportunity became available, it was the perfect mix of working with young people, because I feel like that's the only way we're going to actually make true change in our society and community. Working amongst systems, putting things together, finding like who or what's not there. That's my creative work. And then being able to support and pour into folks around coaching and leadership. And so it just became the really perfect storm, if you will, of something that I love to do. And here I am.
That sounds great. Thanks for sharing that. I love hearing people talk about their passion in life. And, we work with young people, and we always try to share our trajectory of, why we started this work and how we were able to get to where we are now. I think young people really want to be able to see folks of color in particular, about and learn more about how we made our path to whatever our passion is. So I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. And so now in this role with Kaleidoscope, you said you do work with young people and coaching, leadership, and with your social work background. So you have a lot of experience being able to work with young people. Can you talk a little bit about, what are some of the programs that you provide for young people, activities. Maybe talk a little bit about, the clients that you work with or the young people, where they're coming from, how they're getting involved.
Sure. So at Kaleidoscope, we've actually grown fairly rapidly in the last 5 years. We're in our 28th year. And in the last 5 years, we have our drop-in center, which is open to ages 12 to 18. Make sure I got that right. 12 to 20, Tuesday through Friday. And it's a drop-in center. It's open. You can come in, they can come out. We offer free meals, snacks. They can access basic needs and resources. And then out of that, we've got some, like, we have a summer institute right now, funded by the Adam board. And so, like, different opportunities for our young folks to just build community. And there's something about being around people who look like you. I call it that space of knowing, right? Like, they can walk in, and even if it's for like 3 hours, their armor can come down just a little bit to be like, these people get me, without even knowing anything about them. We have our education outreach department. We are the statewide hub for the Ohio GSA network. For a lot of folks, that was the Gay Straight Alliance when we were in high school. And now it's the Gender and Sexualities Alliance. It's part of a national network. So we're the hub here in Ohio. And then we do education and training actually throughout the United States for anyone who's serving young people, providers, community members, families. We have our civic engagement and advocacy work that we do with our youth. We have a voter guide we put out every year. We're doing some issue-based advocacy and testifying. There's a lot of horrible bills in the state house now, so we're really working with our young folks to get their testimonies in and to collaborate. And then probably our largest growing department is, and where we have the most direct services, is our community-based wellness. And there we've got 3 housing programs. Those are for ages 18 to 24. We have case management, which is for ages 16 to 24, and then we have behavioral health. I'm actually in the process of hiring our second therapist. And all of this, it's this great circle of making sure basic needs are met, because we want our folks to thrive. Like, survival is not enough. We want more, but also to find ways to amplify their voices. And so we also have a community advisory board, which we're expanding across the state for next year, to really make sure we have that input from our youth, so we can be like youth-led. We say youth-led, youth-informed, and youth-inspired.
That's interesting. I wanted to touch on one thing you mentioned, and I think I saw it, and I was kind of doing some research on learning more about your organization and your background, and that you mentioned there are some horrible bills in the right now. You talk about advocacy. I wanted to touch on that a little bit, and maybe you could explain a little more about what those bills are, how they're impacting, your work.
Sure. Yeah, currently there's a lot happening in the state house that's unfavorable, but the 3 major ones are it's House Bill 616, which some people are saying is Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, or Ohio's version of Florida's, and we don't like to say that, because that's not what it's about. It wants to ban teaching or talking about sexual orientation, gender identity, but also intersectionality, critical race theory. Really, they just don't want youth to be taught the truth about anything. And the reason why we try to steer away from the Don't Say Gay, because it's so intersectional. It's not just looking at one community. It's wanting to take out anybody who's different, and there are histories and our stories. And we like this. Everybody has a sexual orientation. Everybody has a sexual gender identity. Every single person that's alive does. And I think some of the ways that those folks try to scare people is putting it in silos and making it a us versus them. So that's 616. There's House Bill 454, which is a gender affirming care ban. And essentially, they want to make it a felony for anyone, whether it's doctors, nurses, but also social workers, counselors, therapists, teachers, to do any type of gender affirmation care for our young folks. So what that can look like, it's not just about medication and the bigger picture issues around surgery. It can be as simple as like affirming pronouns. With our young folks, when we introduce ourselves, I would say, like, my name's Erin, my pronouns are she, her, what are your pronouns? Like, that's our common language. And so that's a form of gender affirming care. And they want to ban that. And then lastly, there's House Bill, it's 61, and they tagged this on at the end of their session this year, but they want to prevent transgender girls from playing sports with cis girls or in their affirmed identity. And that's to me feels like the most egregious, because they talk about possibly doing like genital checks and those kind of things that are just like not okay,
Mhm.
regardless of where it's coming from. And so, we approach this a couple of ways. One is we don't want them to pass. We want the communities to know like these are harmful. Don't get tricked into thinking it's just about those gay kids, because it's not. It's about all of us. But
Mhm.
also, our young people hear that. They hear these conversations, they see these bills, and they see folks, adults, questioning their humanity and their dignity in a very public way. And as Black folks, this is something that our community has had, continues to deal with, depending on what the
Mhm.
topic is. And so having a nation or leaders question your humanity and dignity and your right to thriving in a public way, and then like it's debatable. It's not
Mhm.
debatable. That's a non-negotiable thing. And so those are, I'll just keep going about this. So like that's what when we want to amplify our youth voices and their stories, and for us as the grown-ups, it's our job to stop those bills from progressing, and then also educating folks as much as possible.
How do you have those conversations with young people? I mean, do they bring it up, or they kind of saying this is what I've heard, and how do you help them extrapolate what's going on?
It really depends. I know our youth in our drop-in center, they view KYC as like a safe haven or a sanctuary. So they actually don't really want to talk about it while they're there. They just want the grown-ups to fix it. Like, can y'all just take care of that?
Mhm.
Um, but there are some. We've got about 50 written testimonies this year from young people to say, like, please stop it. This is harmful. This is hurtful.
Mhm.
Um, and one-to-one conversations, our youth really, they want to talk about it, and they want people to know, because one of the bills says that anyone, teacher, social worker, counselor, any professional working with the youth, if a young person is questioning or maybe seems like they might be exploring their gender identity or sexual orientation, that their parents should be notified. And 100% of our youth are saying, first of all, no, it's not an emergency. An
Mhm.
emergency is if I break my arm or if I'm otherwise hurt. But this isn't an
Mhm.
emergency, and it's putting us in unsafe spaces. And so what they're noticing collectively is this, I think, removal of their autonomy as human beings, back to that questioning their humanity and dignity.
Mhm.
And then it's scary. It's scary how they're going to move through the world. Are people, can they have access to care that's evidence-based, best practice care? But then it also, when we have these conversations and people are saying them, it almost gives license for folks who want to be discriminatory or say mean and hurtful things. It almost gives them license to do that. And so it just increases or ups the ante of what it means to be an adolescent in general. And then you add all these other issues on that really challenges their sense of belonging.
That's interesting how you said the students are like, look, adults just take care of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Take care of it. I'm curious, when you do have young people come and they're interacting with you and your staff and other folks that are working with your organization, what other, concerns or challenges that they may share? Do they, you may not want to get deep into any um, examples, but what kind of things are young people sharing about what they're, for those who may be in a certain place of exploring their identity?
Sure. Um, prior to COVID, we were seeing about 500 unique youth in our drop-in center per year, with about 5,000 engagements total.
Hmm.
And of those youth, demographically, about 47% were identifying as transgender or non-binary, and about 46% were Black, or
Hmm.
otherwise, communities of color. And so for them coming there, it was really about that space of belonging and navigating school, being misgendered, teachers refusing to use affirmed names and pronouns for fear that
Hmm.
they would get in trouble when it actually is not illegal to do so. Um, Family rejection, especially amongst our youth of color. That's probably the biggest challenge, that they'll say, like, being queer and Black or being trans and Latina or whatever it is like it feels hopeless because there's lack of acceptance and affirmation in their families. Um, so it really is around that belonging and having a safe place to be. I mean, we've seen young folks come in dressed one way, change clothes into that affirms their gender identity, and then change again before they go back home for safety reasons.
Wow. Wow.
And then, within our schools, when we work with our youth a lot, it is back to like having those teachers or administrators affirm who they are. And then when we look at like our housing, I would say housing is, I mean, they're all related, but LGBTQ youth are 120% more likely to be homeless than their peers. And they
Really?
represent about 40% of the homeless population. And so I like to give the number here. I think it was in 2019 in Central Ohio, over 3,000 youth were identified as being homeless, 14 to 24. And so anecdotally, if we look at those numbers, that's almost 1,500 young people that were part of the LGBTQ community that were homeless.
Wow.
And the number one reason for homelessness for our young people is family rejection and not being safe at home.
Mhm.
And then those numbers always go up for Black folks, for transgender, non-binary youth. And so like it's this whole idea of like basic needs is really what our young folks are struggling with. In our counseling program, 50% of youth in there on our counseling are Black youth. In our
Mhm.
housing program, 60% are Black. And then we have an emergency housing program. So those are young people who would go to the shelters if they had nowhere else to go. 100% of them are Black youth. And so, and I bring these numbers up because there's so much conversation in response to youth of color and Black youth and mental health, which we must be doing. But our
Mhm.
LGBTQ youth get left out and excluded time and time again. And it's very harmful. I understand why it is from a community and faith and historical perspective.
Mhm.
But it comes down to this basic needs of safety, psychological safety, housing, and having experiences of belonging. And then when our young people have that, we can look at their academics, right? Like, are they, turning in their homework and all those other things? And then just the traditional challenges that folks have in their own communities.
You mentioned your housing program. So how does that program work when a young person needs emergency housing, or they just need a temporary place to stay based off their, rejection of family or what have you? How does that work?
Sure. So we have our emergency housing and we have a partnership with an extended stay, actually. And we'll use other hotels if needed. And basically, we are able to have our young folks in there for 2 weeks at a time. We don't kick them out at 2 weeks, but we just reassess every 2 weeks. So they can at least like know the next day they don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
And during that time, we work with them to get stable and hopefully find their next step of more permanent housing. We've been fairly successful through our partnerships like Huckleberry House and Star House,
Yeah.
being able to utilize some of their transitional living programs. We also have a rapid rehousing program, which our young folks move in, we get them in the house as quickly as possible, and then we provide rental support. And rapid rehousing, depending on where it's being provided, sometimes folks have to be exited in 90 days, 6 months, maybe 12 to 20, maybe 12 to 24, depending on the youth programming. And what we're really negotiating now is we want our youth to be ready to be independent. And so what does it mean to be ready? And so we've got a couple young folks who are in their third year in our rapid rehousing payment. And in fact, we pay for everything. And then we work with them to like get employment, get back into school, get their primary care needs, like all those things that you need to have to be healthy. And now we're just kind of figuring out what does it mean to be ready so they don't fall back into homelessness. And then our last one is our supportive co-housing, and that's a shared group living experience. It's not a group home, but it's more like you have roommates, like one
Mhm.
or two roommates. And I look at it, I have two college age kids at home. And it's very similar to what happens in that 18 to 24 year age is like, you got to learn to live with other people.
Right.
And
Right.
so those, if young people are, in need of shelter, we've got information and I can provide those links for you before we're done today to access that. But then also working within our housing programs, that's something that, we do have a bit of a wait list that we just opened up another supportive housing site this month.
Mhm.
Uh, we have 2 duplexes and then we have youth on each side. So um, it's been a journey. Housing is a whole other beast.
Yeah.
But it feels good to know that we're able to do that in a way without barriers. Like with the funding we have, we don't utilize any HUD funding currently. So we can be
Oh,
low barrier and not have the constraints, and the definitions of homelessness typically are very restrictive. And for LGBTQ young people, they don't always meet that criteria. They do a lot of couch surfing. or engaging in, they're not what's traditionally homeless, like living on the streets. But we don't want them to be. We want to do the work of prevention, right? We don't want to
Mhm.
wait until they're in a dangerous situation. We want to get them in a place to be stable before bad things start to happen.
Well, that sounds like an awesome program. One other thing you mentioned kind of piqued my interest, or my ears popped up when you talked about LGBT youth of color specifically. I wanted
Yes.
to maybe to go there, and you mentioned that based off of like quote unquote traditional values within the Black community specifically,
Hmm.
that there's this friction for,
Yes.
for those young people, their families, et cetera. I'm curious about, you know, any of the young people that you've encountered and that would fit that description, kind of, I wonder if we could dive deeper into what that means or how they're experiencing that and how they're coming to you. Is it something that they identify with their family, say, this is how I identify, and then it's like, there's this friction. It's like, oh, now I have to find a place to stay, or I'm getting ostracized. I'm not really sure how
Yes.
does a young person, I can't imagine being a teenager, dealing with everything a teenager has to go through, or young,
Right.
just
Right.
in general. And then, like you said, having that on top of that, and then being a young person of color, how does that dynamic, how do your counselors, that just seems very, very traumatic, right? And I was reading something where you talked about your group, your organization really works, and I think, quote, you really work to disrupt what causes trauma and harm, so excuse me, harm and trauma. So I'm curious, how does that manifest itself in your day-to-day activity with these young people? That's a big thing that they have to go through. How do you do that? That's just, I'm fascinated by how you phrase that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question.
I know it's a lot there, but
Yeah, I mean, and I'm thinking a little bit like even my own personal experience, and like in my family, raised in church. One of my parents is an elder in the church, like all of those things. And I have not experienced rejection, but there's a tolerance maybe, but not
mm,
necessarily a full out affirmation, with
mm,
one of my parents in particular. And that's not uncommon with our young folks of color. And so maybe they're tolerated in their home. That's actually sometimes they're like happy just with that. But often what happens is their parents will tell them, you can't be in my house doing that kind of thing. Don't bring that mess into my house. And so you start to hide who they are, who they're dating. And hiding who you are takes a toll on somebody
absolutely,
over
yeah,
time. For our transgender, non-binary youth, especially, it's the criticism, the lack of affirmation and validation. I mean, I think anything when you think about like what harms like our souls, like that thing that makes you like takes your light out inside, that's what a lot of our youth of color are experiencing. Not all. We have quite a few young folks who come and their parents are very supportive, their families are, and so it's
mm,
it's a generalization, but those numbers are very high. um, when we talk about disrupting that which causes harm and trauma, I think there's a few ways to do that. I mean, one is just providing that space of you get to come in and you get to say who you are. And so even
mhm.
every day, when we do like our community building part of programming, the youth get to say their names and their identity, their pronouns. And a few years ago, there was this one young person who was like playing around with different names for about 2 weeks. They had a different name. And I
Mhm.
remember, and as an adult, it's easy to just kind of like, oh my God, pick a name. But like every day, it was this really beautiful process of watching them to see like what felt
Yeah,
good and
yeah.
to just say like, hey, who are we today? Or tell me your name today. And I think creating that space and that expansion for young folks to exist begins to disrupt what the world tells us, like you don't get to exist, or you have to shrink yourself, or if you'd be great if you would do this. And we're like, you are great and beautiful just as you are. Your life, we hold your life, we hold your dignity just as you are. And so offering that opportunity to, like, from a place of a nervous system, I like to look at, like, the fight or flight and how our bodies get into that. But when I said, take their armor down, hopefully when they're part of our programming, they get to experience rest in a way that they don't in the world and their families. And so we know just from a biological perspective, less cortisol, better health outcomes. And so that's one way.
Mhm.
But also, we really really work hard to disrupt the systems and transform the systems that created harm. And so, one example is like how with our funding, like I mentioned with our housing, and we utilize the least restrictive funding so that we can be in a space that's equitable and sustainable and not have to make our young folks jump through all the hoops that happen in nonprofits, right? And it's for good reason. We understand there's data, there's all of these, and we've got to, as a collective, be willing to fund and resource organizations and trust them to do the work and not burden them.
Yeah.
We are staunchly anti-adultist, and so what that means, and it's funny. Yesterday, I just realized I did an adultist thing, or Wednesday, talking to a young person. But being adultist is essentially shrinking the life and voice and experience of a young person. And so, an example is if a young person says, like, their heart gets broken from a relationship. They're 15, and we might say, "Oh, girl, please, you're 15. You don't even know what heartbreak is." Right? and who hasn't said it, self included? I'm a parent. I've got an 18 and 20-year-old. Yes, but it's really flipping backing up and giving them room. We give them the dignity of risk. They might do something that we don't think is a great idea. This, especially in our housing program, but we allow them the opportunities to do those things that aren't, horribly harmful, but then provide a safe landing. And that, when I look at our young folks in our housing program in particular, but even in our drop-in center, a lot of them, what they don't have is that safe landing from their families of origin. And so we want to provide that to show them something else is actually possible. And we are going to provide that and offer that to you. And we're going to be here, even if you mess up, even if you make a mistake, we're still going to be here and be that soft landing. And we're going to coach you and we're going to guide you and support you in that. And I think that, when I look at disrupting things, that's a world, we get to create a world that we know is possible, both within our organization, amongst our team, but also in the community. We know something else is possible, but if people don't get to experience it or see it, how can they champion it and then do the work for that to happen in other places?
Right, absolutely. That's amazing, the way you think about that and the way you express it. So I can hear the passion.
Yeah.
People's. That's what I'm really excited about listening to you talk. I was curious. So when I was growing up, the different terms like transgender, binary, non-binary, some of the others, I can't think of all of the other ones, but there's how, for someone growing up, that those weren't necessarily a thing, right? You didn't have all those different terms, or how folks want to identify. For anyone who is still maybe like, well, I'm not really sure what these terms mean or how they correlate to a person's identity.
Sure.
For the person who's not sure and would need more information or to learn more about these things, where could they go to be more educated, and so that they can be an advocate or an ally or be in that space where they're not inflicting harm or trauma to anyone?
Sure. I love this question. And I think, first, when people don't understand something, their impulse is to be like, well, that must be bad, or to dismiss it. And I think, what I want to say to folks is it's okay to not understand what things mean. It's okay. It doesn't mean it's bad. You just don't understand it. But in getting that information, we have a really dynamic education department. There's even an online training that folks can take. It's self-paced, and it's called Demystifying the LGBTQI+ acronym. And that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And it really digs into what does that mean? What is gender identity? And it also invites folks to kind of think about the ways they were raised to think about gender identity and their own journey, if you will, because we all, like I said before, we all have a sexual orientation, we all have a gender identity. So that would be a really great place to start, is utilizing that. And we also are happy to come into places. I know we've worked with City Year during training as well. But also, our young folks are really good at, if we listen and are curious, they'll tell us what those things mean to them. And so it's this fine line of curiosity and oh, what does identity mean to you, versus making them teach you everything, right? It's a balance in doing that. But I think being curious, because here's the thing, as identity is across, some people say Black, some people say African American. They mean different things to different people. Same thing with the word queer, right? And so back to that being curious and having those personal relationships to get an understanding of what does that mean to someone. So like I use queer to describe myself. It's not just about who I have relationships with, but it's also my politics. It's the way that I navigate the world. It's the way I look at the world. Like it's different. It's outside the status quo. And it's me and my wholeness. And so that's what that means to me. And for a young person, it could be something completely different. And that's beautiful. I love being Black. I rarely say African American because like I'm Black and like that means something to me, right? And other folks don't even care. And it's very similar when we look at identity. And so the curiosity piece and having those relationships is a really great way to get more information. And like I said, call us in. We're happy to work with you all for training and education.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that, every year your folks come in and they do a training or maybe a series of trainings. I can't remember with our core members on a lot of these topics and helping them understand, because they're working directly with students every day. So that's always a good, I get a chance to sit on. That's where I learned a lot of some of these things. I'll be honest, a couple of years ago when we started using, when I first came here, we weren't really using pronouns. That wasn't, we didn't really do that. And then that started to become part of how we introduce ourselves. And then I started learning more, sitting in other trainings and kind of like, oh, I had no idea that was how this, what these terms mean. And so I got a much better understanding and a fuller education about the work that you're doing. So we really appreciate that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And something I want to add about, I was in a training myself about a week ago, and I had never utilized this language. And it wasn't a like LGBT centered training at all. It was professional development for myself. And somebody was like, why do we put our pronouns? And the instructor said, so that we can see you in your full humanity. This is so beautiful. Like we do all this technical, like, because you can't tell someone's gender identity and all of those things. But I thought that's why, yes, that's absolutely why all of this matters, to relate to people, to work with youth, to be in those schools, and we're seeing them in their full humanity. That's what all of us want and deserve.
And I love how you said seeing others in humanity. One of our values is the word Ubuntu. You may be familiar with the word Ubuntu. My humanity is tied to yours. Like I have a couple T-shirts to say that. So I think that's basic, right? That crosses all different types of things that we're doing and how we treat each other at all different levels. So we're like vibing on that right there.
Yeah, I got chills when you said that. Yeah,
that's my favorite City Year, value that we take from that South African proverb. So yeah, that's a good connection there. So could you share a little bit, just really quickly? You mentioned that individuals can go to your website and learn more about trainings and opportunities to connect with you. What could you share with your website? We'll share it at the end of the podcast and when we post it. But could you share how they can get in contact?
Yeah, our website is kycohio.org, and there's a drop-down menu, and specifically, so it talks about our center-based programming. And on that first page, there's at the very bottom is a calendar that talks about all of our programs that are happening. And again, that drop-in center is open to 12 to 20-year-olds to come in between, I think it's 3:30 to 6:30. And I think what's important is that there is no cost for any of our services.
Okay.
To our youth, they're all no cost. For our trainings, that's a little different because that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, going there to that website, you can see ways. We have a Discord server as well, so youth can see how to sign up for our Discord server. And then under our education outreach, it lists like how to request a training, what type of training you're looking for. And then towards the bottom, it shows access to our online self-paced training that helps demystify that acronym, which our Director of Education Outreach, Amanda, put together, and it's really phenomenal. But yeah, all of our services, and then also for our community-based wellness department, anybody who's looking for housing, case management, or therapy would fill out, there's a referral form, and then our service coordinator will contact them. And again, this is what I love about, this work with our therapy is like all of those sessions are at no cost to our young people. They don't have to worry about insurance or any kind of billing. And that's really important when we talk about disrupting, that's also decreasing those barriers and increasing.
Exactly. You just answered. I was just going to ask that question about how do folks access those services,
Mhm.
and was there a cost to them? So that's good information for folks to know. I wanted to switch a little bit. This is some really good information that you're sharing. Young people, social media, music,
Yeah.
anything that they're connecting to. We know how it's impacting our young people in many different ways, and
Mhm.
a lot of it is, and we both know this. It can be harmful when you're
Yeah.
accessing too much of it. So for the young people that you're interacting with, how do you see their access to social media, or how is the social media impacting them, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to their identity or their race or however they're presenting themselves to your staff? How does the social media piece and music and other things from outside world coming in, how are
Mhm.
they processing those, and how are you helping them in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, there can definitely be a negative or unfavorable impact from social media in the outside world. Um, what we are seeing, though, is online communities really for our young people have been a space of saving for them,
Okay.
because they can, one, they have access to information, which, take it or leave it, it's good or bad, but they
Yeah.
also can build community that way. And for our young folks, a lot of emerging mental health symptoms, I'm sure your people are seeing in the schools, and like our youth with their anxiety and depression and things of that nature, being behind, a phone or camera actually feels safer for them. And so they
Mhm.
access social media to build community, to find resources. And so I would almost say it's a positive thing in that regard. And there's research out there around like queer youth and online communities too. And so we've seen the numbers, but like that's actually what is happening. Um, I would say even like TV shows, I don't, TV's a whole different experience these days, but
Mhm.
there's shows on like Netflix and Hulu that are very much inclusive and affirming. And our young people love to watch those shows because, and I was just having this conversation recently with someone, like the world that we talk about wanting to create, it's actually happening. So when we watch
Mhm.
some of these shows, nothing is coming to mind right now, but they are like, they're super inclusive and don't make someone's sexual orientation a big deal. There's just who
Yeah.
they are. They've got issues at home or they are got a job, but it's like it's that representation that is more present and available for our youth that is really affirming to them. So I think social media, music, and just pop culture in general, it's very reflective for our young people overall and seeing themselves and the diversity of what's possible, and finding community.
Now, for you said the young people that come in, the ages are again. You mentioned the age band,
Sure. Our age range totally, it completely is 12 to 24.
24. Okay.
And then we actually do monthly groups for under 12, but it's ages 8 to 12. So kind of like that older elementary school or younger middle school age. We do that once a month. And so our drop-in center is 12 to 20. We do some programming for 18 to 24-year-olds as well, like a young adult night. And then, of course, our behavioral health programs and housing, and our therapy programs, behavioral health, are 12 to 24 as well.
Mhm.
But then case management is 16 to 24 and housing is 18 to 24.
So that 8 to 12 group, I was interested when you said that. I didn't know you worked a little bit with that age group.
Mhm.
For those who may say that, and I've heard this before. You probably heard it or I've read it,
Mhm.
that young people that age, they don't understand what their gender identity is, and they're not in a space to even explore that. They're too young to understand that. What do you say to folks that are expressing that sentiment?
They absolutely understand and know, even if they don't have the academic language for it. I used
Mm,
to actually facilitate a support group for about 5 years for youth ages 5 to 12, and who were transgender or non-binary or even exploring their gender identity.
mhm,
And that's back to that. I said that space of knowing where they get to come in their butterfly wings or whatever it is they're doing, and their friends are like, "That's cool." And they're like, "Want to play? Yeah, let's go play." Like that's the experience, and the things that we talked about and that are talked about still with that 8 to 12-year-old is like how to be a good friend,
mm,
um, learning new games. Sometimes the youth will talk about like privacy versus being having a secret, being honest, and like, so again, most things that that demographic, that age group that's important to development, that still exists.
Okay.
But what we know from child development is our gender identity is like it's within us between the ages of 3 to 5.
Okay.
And so I don't know how many people have ever experienced this, but you're in the grocery store, a little kid walks up, I'm a girl, are you a girl or a boy? Like they're usually between 3 to 5 years old. We just don't think about it unless there's a variance or something different. But and then you don't always have the language, but they've got the behavior. It's persistent. It is something they'll see in the clothing they might choose or the toys or who they want to play with. And so back to this not being an adultist, like we can trust our young people. And that doesn't mean an 8-year-old, maybe who was born assigned female at birth says, I want to be a boy. The question is, or the answer isn't, no, you can't be. It's, what does that mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because for them, it might just mean they want to have short hair. Let them get their hair cut. Right? We're not talking about sex. We're not talking about genitals. We're not doing anything that's not age appropriate. And most kids in that age aren't wanting that information anyway.
Right.
But then I also like to say to parents and caregivers, or anybody who's like, well, they're just going through a phase. And I say, well, can we love them through that phase? We love our kids through so many phases. So many. Why can't we love them through this and when they're trying to explore who they are in this world and how they want to show up?
Oh, that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. That's interesting how you're able to navigate that space with the younger folks.
Yeah.
We have about 10, 15 minutes left, but I do want to go back really quickly to the advocacy piece that you talked about and how you advocate for policies and things that are you deem harmful, or like you said, or you would use the word horrible. In terms of I think you mentioned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you have a youth advocacy community or committee or group that helps with testimonies and things of that nature. Could you talk a little bit about how you're getting these young folks involved in these policies at the state level or what's going on nationally? How are you preparing them to share their testimony and share their stories and getting them to understand that, yeah, we're seeing this on a level here. Here's what's happening at the state level, national level, and how it impacts you in your identity and what you want to do in life.
Yeah. So yeah, we have a community advisory board, which, like I said, next year we're going to really be intentional about being statewide. And that group really is to help inform and inspire and lead the direction of the organization. And so an example of how we've used that or utilized that process in the past, I think it was in 2020, issue 2 around this, I think it was a civilian review board was out there. And, we're nonprofits, so we can't do electoral politics. But like our staff and our board unanimously voted to support that. We had to go to our community advisory board to also say, do you all want us to endorse this? And, when you want to talk about doing the actual work, I had to be prepared for them to say no and then not do it, even though we all were like, yes, let's support this. And they all agreed and they wanted to support it. But that's an example of how we partner with our community advisory board to lead and inform us. In terms of like the testimony and the stories, we just ask them during our drop-in center. Fridays are typically our most attended program night, upwards of 35 youth sometimes. And so our team will just say, what are your thoughts about this? And or do you want to write it down, or can we help you write it down? And so there's a lot of modeling for that and support. We also are collecting stories for another project we're working on. And so we'll do the one-to-one asking questions and letting them just say how they feel about it, just directly going to the source. That's one thing that I often see missing amongst organizations that I believe have great intent as adults, but they don't bring in the youth voice. Like, what is it they really want and how does this impact them? Which means we have to slow down a little bit, right? It means when we're at tables or if we're creating a task force, there should be young people that are members of that. And so that's something that we also do. One, we want their voices, we want to amplify them, but 2, this is how we train up the next generation, if you will. This is how we connect them to leadership. And it's almost, I don't like the word pipeline for multiple reasons, but it almost begins to create that leadership pipeline because they get exposed to people who are in power and how things work and the processes of it. We also have our summer institute every year for 6 weeks where we talk about some of those like movement ecology and like and our youth like want to go there. They talk about things like imperialism and what all of that means. And so we have those 6 weeks where they get to talk about how all of this works together to inform the work. So we do it from multiple ways. Most importantly, in making sure that we're always, as much as possible, amplifying their voices, centering their voices, and making sure they get to be a part of those conversations.
We need to shout that from the rooftops, involve the youth in what we're trying to achieve. Their voice means more than ours, right? Because they are the young people. So that's a great point. I appreciate that. One last thing I want to ask you is the opportunity to participate or volunteer. How do folks get involved?
Love this question. There's multiple ways that you can support KYC and our young people. We do have volunteer opportunities, again, on our website, kycohio.org. We've got people who, if you want to volunteer and have direct contact with young folks, we use center volunteers. And so that's somebody being there during drop-in center hours and being that positive, safe adult, that mentorship, which we know across all kinds of studies that having a positive adult in your life is often the key to resiliency for our young folks. People can also volunteer for special events. We have other prom, and I think it's in May typically, which is prom for our youth. And again, pre-COVID, we had, oh my goodness, one year, over 400 youth who attended, and they represented about 70 schools from across the state.
Wow.
Yeah, this past year we had to cap our to 275 just because of COVID still. But there's people can volunteer for special events. We also do volunteer days of service, which is really popular amongst organizations or for-profit places where groups of people come in and they work on special projects. So they could be administrative projects, they could be assembling resource bags and kits, like just whatever the need is. And it doesn't have to be an organization. We've had somebody do it for their birthday with their friends. So those volunteer days of service are really important. But then, the other way is always finding a way to contribute. And so we have our KYC Unity Circle, which it actually breaks down like which dollar amount, what it provides, like what $5 monthly, how that supports a young person, for transportation. Because we do provide bus passes for them to get to and from. So we really try to remove any barrier possible to getting support. And then, what I really love to tell people is definitely, pursue education and training, invite us into your world to support that. But I think one of the best ways to contribute and to support our youth is to love on young people in your life. Take a step back, expand, give them room to figure it out. And affirming someone's humanity, you're not affirming anything bad. You're just affirming, hey, I see you and you're worthy of this love. You're worthy of this dignity. You are worthy of this belonging. Like that's something we can do every single day, right? Like it's our collective charge, I believe, it's not about saving our young people. Like they're good. They just need that support so they can continue to grow and flourish and to be a soft landing in whatever way makes most sense is one of the best ways to contribute and to support our youth and to invest in their worlds.
I was going to ask you what would be one last takeaway to share with the listeners, but that sounded like it right there.
That's it right there.
That was the cap on everything. So thank you for sharing everything you shared today around advocacy and policy and therapy and counseling and giving me more information and knowledge about how young people are presenting themselves to your organization and the services they're getting. I knew you all did a lot, but now I got a much more intensive understanding of how you're serving people. And of course, you're going to be coming in this year to working with our core members to kind of share the exact same things you're sharing today. And also thank you for sharing for the opportunities for volunteering and participating. I'm sure folks can donate as well if they want to donate resources or things like that. They can go to your website. So this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time today. Is there one more thing you want to share, just kind of to cap what KYC is all about?
Yeah, I think, going back to legislation, and because we're in election year, always, it seems like, is
Mhm.
don't allow folks to create division by putting us in silos and saying something is a gay thing or a Black thing or a woman thing. Like, we are all interconnected, right? Ubuntu. And so, like, it expands across spectrums, and taking away body autonomy for one group impacts all groups. And so the invitation is for people to think a little more broadly, and let's not get hooked on that's not a problem. Black folks are part of the LGBTQ community. People of color are part of the LGBTQ community. And so that would be the invitation, is, as we see these bills and legislation and people having these conversations, to be curious and to find yourself in that, even if it's around experiences of belonging and how we all need that. That should be enough to lift up our interdependence upon each other.
Okay, now that's how we're going to end it. That's going to cap it off right there. And I love that. Thank you. So that was excellent. I really appreciate you sharing that and how people can think about this work and get involved. And like I said, Ubuntu, humanity, it all comes back to that. So once again, we want to thank Erin Upchurch, the Executive Director for Kaleidoscope Youth Center, thank you for connecting with us and learning more about your organization, yourself, your background, your services. We really appreciate that. Now, this episode will be, once it's posted, you'll be able to see it on Spotify, Facebook, and we'll also make sure to tag KYC so they can also, all of your supporters can see it. And all the other social media outlets will make sure that it's available for everyone here in the next week or so. We'll make sure that happens in our newsletters. So feel free to take this and use it for your own constituents and supporters. So thank you so much for your time today, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me.
See you, everybody.
Take care.